Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In today's program, we're going to talk about the Ummayyad dynasty, one of the most important dynasties in the sort of Islamic civilization in the Arab period. And to help me discuss this important period of Islamic history, I have Amjad Hussain and Arif Ahmad sahab. Welcome again.
Oh, thank you for having us. Thank you.
No, thank you for joining us. Amjad, if I could start with yourself. Clearly, Islam as a major religion was set up by the Holy Prophet of Islam, and the righteous caliphs then guided the Muslim community. And take us from the period of the fourth Hazrat Ali Raziyallahu anhu, where he had to deal with a lot of social strife within the Muslim community, and what happened and how the Umayyads came about.
Of course, as you know, Iqbal Sahib, following the first civil war in Islam and after the assassination of Hazrat Ali Radiyallahu anhu, Amir Muawiyah, he founded the Ummayyad dynasty. He split away from the caliphate and he set up a rival caliphate in Damascus. And the Umayyad dynasty, whose name is derived from the Umayyad ibn al-Sham. Umayyad's like I mentioned, great-grandson Muawiyah founded the Umayyad Caliphate in 661 of the Common Era. It is well known that he refused to accept the caliphate of Ali, and Muawiyah ultimately transferred his capital to Damascus, where he was previously the governor of that province. And of course, there is a prelude to all this thing that dates back to the assassination of the third caliph, Uthman bin Affan radiyallahu anhu. He was besieged by several rioters for several reasons, and the main reason was that the Caliph Uthman radiallahu anhu appointed many members from his Banu Ummayyad clan, many of the governors in the key Islamic provinces, and there was general disaffection with these appointments that the Caliph was promoting his own clan above other righteous and capable Muslims, and there were obviously some famines, and there was dissent in Egypt, there was dissent in Iraq, present-day Iraq, Kufa, and so on. So these people, they marched on to Medina and besieged the Caliph's house. And then Uthman radiallahu anhu appointed Ali radiallahu anhu to calm the situation down. So he approached these rebels and he calmed them down. He said, look, go back to your cities and all your grievances be dealt with, the administrative grievances and so on, and the distribution of various, of course, funds and so on, and the taxes. But what happened was at that time Uthman radiallahu anhu was surrounded in Medina by people from his own clan, chief among them Marwan, who was the chief secretary to the Caliph. And when the rebels agreed to go back to their cities and calm down, he sent out a courier to the governor of Egypt, and the courier overtook these rebels when they were heading back to Egypt, and they seized the courier, and in his possession was a letter, and that letter had the seal of the Caliph Uthman radiallahu anhu, and that letter was addressed to the governor of Egypt, to the governor of Cairo, that kill all these rebels when they head back to Egypt. And obviously the rebels, instead of going back to Egypt, they marched onto the Medina again and besieged the house of the Caliph. And upon subsequent discovery, it was found out that that letter was not signed by the Caliph himself, but it was done by his chief secretary, Marwan. And Marwan has been known throughout Islamic history of being a mischief maker.
So started the
strife.
Difficult period and the strife, and again he was assassinated sadly, and then Hazrat Ali had to cope with subsequent events as well.
Subsequent events, and this obviously the assassination of the third caliph led to the first civil war. First, Aisha radiallahu anha approached Ali and some of the Muslims in Medina, and first is the wife of the Prophet, who we covered the battle of the camel before,
yes,
and that was defeated, and then Ali had to obviously Muawiyah was already the governor, like I said, he was appointed.
Well, he'd been appointed by Hazrat Umar
Umar radiallahu anh. Actually,
Yeah.
Umar radiallahu anh transferred him. Then Uthman radiallahu anh reappointed him as the Caliph of Damascus, where he trenched himself and he marched on to Medina, and he disputed with Ali, and he never accepted the caliphate of Ali. And this led to the first civil war in Islam. Subsequently, there was arbitration. Ali accepted the arbitration of Muawiyah, the third person to arbitrate between the two warring sides, because actually the forces of Muawiyah were being defeated in the Battle of Siffin, and the tactical move where they hung the Quran on the swords and asked, and obviously Hazrat Ali, being a righteous man, a noble man, he stopped fighting, and the reason was that Hazrat Ali didn't want the bloodshed of Muslims to continue, and that was the reason. Otherwise, he could have rammed home his advantage and defeated Muawiyah. And that would have been the end of all matters, but he didn't, and he accepted arbitration. And ultimately, the emissary of Amir Muawiyah, he basically colluded with the emissaries of the arbitrators, and asked both the protagonists to step down. Obviously, and that brought down Ali to be a rebel as well.
Yeah, of course.
And obviously that situation was untenable to Ali radiallahu anh. And of course then, as we know, this feud continued. We had two caliphates basically, a caliphate in Damascus and a caliphate in Kufa. Unfortunately, some of the renegades...
Although it wasn't a fully fledged caliphate at that stage. Amir Muawiyah just sort of... but it was the assassination by the Kharijites of Ali radiallahu anhu, after which really he openly declared into Amir Muawiyah that he was the Caliph.
Then, of course, after unfortunately, the demise of assassination and of Hazrat...
Can you tell us a little bit about the Kharijites? These were disgruntled people. I mean, their name lives on.
Of course. They are, you can say, the first... die-hard fanatics in Islam, who were really very much against Muslims themselves.
Yes.
And they thought by Ali accepting first the truce in the Battle of Siffin, where he had superior forces, superior position. Why did he accept why did he accept a truce when he could have rammed home his position and defeated Muawiyah? Of course, the reason Ali accepted, and that's the first disagreement they had with the Caliph, is why why you accepted the truce, why didn't you ram home your advantage? And the second was, the other thing they said was that because they regarded Muawiyah to be unjust and Ali to be righteous, and originally that's what their opinion was. And then of course righteousness does not give in to falsehood. So they said your faith must be weak, and they started questioning the faith of the Caliph himself. And this is what actually now the trend we have in the these what we call takfiri trend is actually borrowed from there, where they question the faith of everybody. Faith is a matter of what is in your heart and what is in your mind. No third person is aware of it except the God himself. But these individuals became judgmental. They started passing takfir, that basically Ali had committed a kind of a religious sin, i.e. his faith was weak, according to the Khawarij, and thus and our followers. And Khawarij means the ones who leave. So they left Ali and they actually waged a war against him, and they were ultimately defeated. But small band of die-hard Khawarij they stayed, and one of them he swore a solemn oath to assassinate the Caliph. And when Ali radiallahu anh was leading one of the prayers, he pounced on the Caliph and assassinated him.
Okay, well, before we move on to the setting up of the Umayyad Caliphate, Arif, I just wanted to move on to you. I mean, clearly Amir Muawiyah was highly regarded throughout the sort of early righteous Caliph periods, and he was appointed, as I said earlier on, by the Umar radiallahu anhu in 639, I think it was, as the governor of Syria. He had many good qualities. Just take us through some of those qualities before we get to this difference.
Of course. Well, absolutely. Just to go back, and just for our listeners, he was actually born in the time of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, born in 601 or 602 in the Common Era, and he actually served the Holy Prophet as his scribe. Later on, he served under the other caliphs. He served under Hazrat Abu Bakr, and as you said, under Hazrat Umar, he became the governor of Syria. Now, obviously, for a person that lived from the time of Islam at its infancy until Islam was spreading around all over the a great part of the earth, he developed many different qualities and went through many different phases. So, although he's known maybe as a military leader, he was also a very dedicated and skillful governor. So he helped the army to develop into a military force. But the way in which he did it was he was actually trying to be inclusive and trying to bring people together. So it wasn't just that he was trying to focus particularly on one tribe or on one particular clan. He would bring people from different backgrounds together. He would take care of Muslims. He would take care of non-Muslims as well. And he was always trying to protect Islam. So as an example of this is during the time, I think under Hazrat Usman, he could see that the Muslims needed protection, and he actually developed the Muslim fleet so that the Muslims could be protected from the Byzantines in the Mediterranean.
That's probably one of his greatest achievements, because the Byzantines had control of the Mediterranean and they could harass Muslims wherever they wanted to. And it was his vision to be able to say that we need a strong navy to counteract that. So go on.
Well, absolutely. He thought that he had the foresight to think that while the Byzantines had this fleet, they could attack Syria, they could attack Palestine, they could attack Egypt. And he didn't do this in a disobedience. He actually asked for permission to develop this fleet, and then started these naval engagements between the Muslims and the Byzantines. And there were various battles like the Battle of the Mass, where basically the Muslims were defending their position. And obviously he was always taking instruction from Hazrat Usman to make sure that the way in which it was being done in a positive way, just to basically protect the Muslims. So this was the start of, you could say, his military experience in terms of looking after the Muslim people, looking after the Muslim empire, and trying to protect their interests from people who he knew were the enemies of the Muslims.
Coming back, Amjad, I mean, obviously, when Hazrat Ali Raziyallahu anhu passed away, Hazrat Hassan Raziyallahu anhu was one of those who could take over the caliphate. But we won't go into the details, but he decided to abdicate and pass on the caliphate to Amir Muawiyah. So he became the first Ummayyad Caliph, as it was. Just take us through that transition period, and he had quite a long rule from 661 to 680. Some of the highlights really of what he achieved.
Sure, like you mentioned, Iqbal, in the sake of peace, the son of Ali, the eldest son of Ali, Hassan ibn Ali, and then for the common good of the Muslims and for the sake of peace, he also forego his right to the caliph, because after the assassination of Ali radiallahu anh, he was the righteous caliph. And among the Sunni school of thought, he's still regarded as one of the fifth caliphs, but also he abdicated in favor of Muawiyah radiallahu anh peacefully. And he made a treaty with Muawiyah radiallahu anh, and that was that Muawiyah should guarantee the peace and security of all Muslims and their well-being. And of course, despite many misgivings, Muawiyah radiallahu anh had enormous abilities, which my good friend Arif Ahmad has alluded to, particularly reorganized the provinces and the administration, and he created many departments within that administration. And to assist the caliph, there were six boards at the center. They were known as the Board of Revenue, the Board of Correspondence, the Board of Signets, the Board of Posts, and the Board of Justice, and the Military Board, to mention a few. And also there was he reorganized the civil service, created the first civil service. At the top tier of the civil service were mainly occupied by Muslim Arabs, and the second tier actually he brought in the new Byzantium converts to Islam, and some of the Jews and Zoroastrians and the Christians were also brought into the administration, and their freedom of thought and freedom of religion as well. So despite Muslim strife, actually Muslims were really, generally Muslims were very kind towards non-Muslims, and they introduced new taxes called the jizya.
Just tell us a little bit more about this jizya, because in the Western world there's a lot of misunderstanding about it, Arif, isn't there?
Absolutely. I think the tax was something that was trying to be fair to everyone. So it wasn't a tax that was just levelled indiscriminately against non-Muslims. It is very misunderstood. People might think that why is it fair to level a tax on non-Muslims? But there were very many exemptions. So, for example, children or women or the elderly or the handicapped, they were not required to pay this. It was basically, in effect, levied on non-Muslims who were part of the Muslim empire, and their contribution for them to be able to profess their faith and to be left alone and not to be damaged or harmed in any way. Even those non-Muslims who actually joined and fought with the Muslim armies, they were exempt from this tax as well. And even priests and monks, they were also not required to pay. So you can see that there was an element of justice to this. Every state, every organization needs some money to run. This was levied in such a way that it was not a burden on the people. It was basically levied according to their own financial means, so that, basically people could afford to pay this, and they would be able to live harmoniously with their Muslim friends and their Muslim neighbors around them.
Yeah,
May I just add to that, because it was never actually a religious discriminatory tax, as has been alluded to by many Orientalists. Actually, you'd be surprised that the churches were exempt from it, the monasteries were exempt from it, so it was not really to punish any Jews, Christians or non-believers. Their places of worship were exempt from it, so they didn't have to pay jizya. It was only on adults who are 18 and over who are of military service. So if they didn't want to be conscripted into the Muslim army, for one reason or another, they can just be levied this tax, they pay this tax, and they can be exempted from the draft.
Amjad, also, I've read that he was someone who very much encouraged peaceful coexistence between the Christians and Muslims. He himself, for example, married a Christian lady, and Yazid was born from that marriage. Can you comment on that a little as well? Because there's a misunderstanding that they basically, taxed and invaded and conquered other people. That was necessarily the case.
Well, of course, like I said, as any caliph and as a good administrator, he needed to run a stable administration from the empire, and he followed many of the ideas of the Byzantium Empire that ruled the region previously. And of course, he needed to make alliances with the local Christian population, the Christian population of Syria, or the Levant as it was known, basically, like, is to further peaceful coexistence and to strengthen the empire. And he also introduced basically salaried government workers who were on the permanent payroll of the Central Secretariat. And like I said, the second tier of that some were run actually by non-Muslims.
Just in terms of geographical area, the empire had expanded quite a bit outside the sort of the Arab lands, hadn't it? During Amir Muawiyah's time, they'd gone into Khorasan and Central Asia and India as well. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. The Ummayyad continued the Muslim expansion in cooperated places like the Caucasus, Afghanistan, present-day Tajikistan, all the way up to the border of China. And of course the Maghrebs, the Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, and the sub-Saharan countries along the Atlantic coast were also became part of the Umayyad Empire. And of course, we're going to mention in another setting, not to forget the Iberian Peninsula was brought on also into the fold of Islam. And of course, at its greatest extent, the Umayyad Caliphate covered over 6 million square miles, and at that time, this is in around the 7th century AD, 62 million people. That was at that time 30% of the world population, making it the 5th largest empire in history in both area and proportion of the world's population.
Now, Amir Caliph Muawiyah passed away in 680, and he changed the system to give hereditary coverage of caliphate to his son Yazid. Arif, that was one of the painful periods in relation to what he did to Imam Hussain. Or Amjad, do you want to cover that painful period briefly?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you know, I mentioned in 680 AD, the Caliph Muawiyah died, and the Caliph was previously had a treaty with the son of Ali radiallahu anh and the grandson of the Prophet Hassan, that upon his death, the Caliphate be decided by the community of Muslim Ummah. But unfortunately, the Caliph did not honor that treaty, and he appointed his own son and Yazid to succeed him. And this was opposed by a number of prominent Muslims, mostly by Abdullah ibn Zubair and many companions of so there were some elderly companions of the Prophet who were still alive in Medina, and also by Hussain. Hussain ibn Ali, the second grandson of the Prophet ﷺ. And obviously this resulted in the conflict known as the Second Fitna or the Second Civil War.
And I suppose also as well, that's really where the division became between what we see today, Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. So that's really where the historical source of this happened, that this battle, which I think took place in Karbala.
Karbala, yes.
Karbala. Yes, it's a very, very sad and tragic event. Because this is a history program, I'm not going to go into that sad moment. But just to say that he didn't survive very long, though, Yazid, did he, after that? His reign didn't last very long, because after that it passed on to the Marwanids, but we will come to that. Just how did he finally die? Do we know?
Not a very good death, unfortunately. Yazid was a very controversial person. He had blood on his hand. He was universally despised by Muslims, and there were cracks starting to appear in his administration, and we know that how he treated the family of the Prophet ﷺ. We completely decimated them, and that's a terrible tragedy and misfortune that fell Islam, and particularly the family of the Prophet ﷺ. And he remains to this day a very controversial figure in history. And of course, everybody knows that Imam Hussain was wronged, and to this day is universally loved by Muslims and non-Muslims alike.
Absolutely. And then, of course, the Ummayyad Caliphate passed on to the Marwanids, and that was probably the longest period, going from 684 to 750. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Marwan the first, who was not a great figure, but his son certainly...
Well, I think we mentioned Marwan before in passing. Marwan was the chief secretary to Caliph Uthman, if you remember, and he's the one behind forging the letter which ordered the death of the rebels of Egyptian, and thus subsequently resulted in the assassination of the third caliph, unfortunately. So Marwan has been known for mischief making in Medina. He made mischief against the third caliph, who was actually a kin of the caliph as well. Marwan is descended from Marwan is basically cousin of the third caliph,
But I'm more interested in his sons, really, because it's Abdul al-Malik. Clearly, he has a very important name in Islamic history. So let's probably cover that period and what his sons...
Well, Marwan died in 685 AD, and then his son Abdul Malik bin Marwan became the caliph. He became the fifth Ummayyad caliph, and he reigned from 685 of the Common Era to 705 of the Common Era. And his most significant achievements were that he built the Dome of the Rock and the Masjid al-Aqsa, which was the foundations for Masjid al-Aqsa were laid during the time of Umar radiallahu anh, but he expanded the Noble Sanctuary. The beautiful dome that we see today on the Noble Sanctuary, known as the Haram al-Sharif, or known as Al-Quds, Dome of the Rock to many in the English language speaking world, and the four-wall court of the temple of Solomon alayhi salam. And of course, his other achievement was that during his time, Muslims they landed on the coast of South Asia, on the coast of India, and now present-day Pakistan. And it was the Ummayyad general known as Muhammad bin Qasim al-Thaqafi, one of the generals of Caliph Abdul Malik bin Marwan. He made successive victories and defeated the the king on the coast of Karachi and the Bombay, because he had took some Arab Muslims as hostages, and to punish the Indian king, the Caliph sent this young general, and he was, it is legend has it that was only 18, this young, just like his other counterpart who landed on Al-Andalus, Tariq bin Ziyad. So this young general led an army that basically invaded India, southern India, present-day Pakistan, and he marched all the way up to the Indus. Some historians say that all the way up to Jhelum. But he could not solidify the victory. But most of the coastal cities remain within the Umayyad Empire.
I think in the first part of this discussion program, it'd be good to end with a quote from The History of the Arabs by Professor Philip Hitti, and then we will carry on with in the second part. And he writes, Marwan, the period 683 to 685, the founder of the Marwanid branch of the Umayyad dynasty, was succeeded by his son Abdul Malik, 685 to 705. The father of kings is title. Under Abdul Malik's rule and that of the 4 sons who succeeded him, the dynasty at Damascus reached the meridian of its power and glory. During the reigns of Al-Walid and Hisham, the Islamic Empire reached its great expansion, stretching from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pyrenees to the Indus and the confines of China, an extent hardly rivaled in ancient times and surpassed in modern times only by the British and Russian empires. To this glorious period belong the subjugation of Transoxania, the reconquest and pacification of North Africa, and the acquisition of the largest European country ever held by Arabs, Spain. So it says quite a bit, doesn't it, really? It's quite an achievement. So I think we've had a good discussion in the first half. Clearly, there's quite a number of different caliphs that come into the Umayyad period. In the second part, we will carry on the discussion, especially looking at some of the great achievements during that period, because in many ways, the Umayyad period was the incubation period for the Abbasids to really flower and blossom and take over. So thanks very much, and we'll restart soon in the second part.
Thank you.
So welcome back. We were covering the period of the Marwanids, and in particular the great achievements and the son of Marwan I, Abdul Malik, whose reign lasted from 685 to 705. Arif, if I could ask you to comment on that period, because there were some great achievements, including the Dome of the Rock. Just tell us a little bit more.
Yes, as mentioned by in the first part of the program about the Dome of the Rock. Just give you a little bit of information, because it's quite a significant building even to this day. Most Muslims and Christians and even Jewish people will be aware of this building. But this was built roughly in the period 688 to 692 in the Common Era. And what it was decided was it was basically to try and use the architectural influence of the Byzantines. So it was a sort of a building that was being used to bridge the gap between the Muslim culture and the culture that was prevalent in that time. And an example of this is that the 2 people that we used, one of them was, both were Muslims, but one was a non-Arab who was actually a native of Jerusalem, Jerusalem being the city in which it was built. And it's got a very definitive, very unusual style. There are no minarets, although it's a Muslim building. It's got a dome. The dome and the building is octagonal in shape, and the dome has lots and lots of windows. But as well as the design of the building, the site obviously is also very, very significant. Significant in the Jewish culture. This is where the Jews believe that there's the last remnants of one of their holiest temples. That rock is actually the foundation stone of this mosque. It's also believed to be the site where the Prophet Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. Now, in Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, they say it was the son Isaac. In Muslim tradition, it's the son Ishmael. So that's obviously very, very significant for all 3 religions. And even in the Islamic tradition as well, there are some Muslim traditions as to this is where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven, but that's not believed by all Muslims. So this was built as very much as a symbol.
The ascension journey is clearly, I think, accepted by all Muslims.
Ascension journey, but not the actual
way
ascension to
and means
heaven.
and how it happened, I think there's a difference in that.
There are
so
some
clearly,
different opinions. But despite that, obviously, still to this day, a very, very religious historical place, and obviously at its time very culturally significant as well. So this was undoubtedly one of the great achievements in that period. Another one of the more administrative things that happened or achievements was the standardization of Arabic. So Arabic became the prevalent language. All the important government documents, they were translated into Arabic. Arabic became the official language, and this became across the whole caliphate that this was a language that people were using. So previously, where there was lots of rights and protections given to the non-Muslims, this was not in a way trying to dominate. This was a way of trying to simplify things and making Arabic the language that everybody would be conversing in, or at least at the government level, this is what everybody would be conversing in.
Apart from these achievements, he gave us three very interesting sons who came to rule in their due time. And the first one, Al-Walid Amjad Sahib, his reign lasted from 705 to 715. And again, during his period, there were some very notable achievements, especially the expansion of the empire. Can you sort of take us through, especially the expansion towards the east side?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like you mentioned, Iqbal Sahib, the three sons, Al-Walid, Suleiman, and Hussain, they figure prominently in the latter part of the Ummayyad dynasty. And as Arif mentioned, apart from the Dome of the Rock, before I had to overseas, just want to complete.
In fact, there were four sons. I just realized there was Yazid as well.
Yazid the second. The Umayyad dynasty had significant achievements in the east. But before I had there, I just want to compliment what my good friend Arif Sahib has just said. Of course, the Dome of the Rock was a significant architectural achievement of the Umayyads, but let's not forget there were two other great mosques. The one in Damascus is a wonderful architecture that again incorporates the Byzantium, the Christian influences as well as the Arab Muslim influences. And the mosque was built on the site of the tomb of Prophet Yahya alayhi salam, known as John the Baptist. And the second mosque was built in Aleppo. These two mosques still stand to this day. And the one in Aleppo is actually built on the tomb of Zacharias alayhi salam. Prophet Zacharias figures prominently in the Judo-Christian as well as Islamic history. He was the chief priest, the prophet, whom Mother Mary, he was the guardian of Mother Mary, Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Jesus. And of course, now heading back towards the east,
and there was, of course, the Prophet's mosque as well.
Of course, yes. Yeah. Of course, the Prophet's mosque was refurbished and enlarged, and so was the noble sanctuary, the Kaaba in Mecca, and new ablution fountains were built and so on. So yes, of course, they did a lot of building, and not to mention the road building to consolidate the empire and the postal services, which my good friend Arif has already alluded to. Now, heading back towards the east, and there was a famous general, the Umayyad general during the time of Al-Walid. And he was Mohammed bin Qasim al-Thaqafi is known. And in the year 712 AD, or the Common Era, he sailed from the Persian Gulf into the Sindh province of present-day Pakistan, and he conquered there. And that battle took place because in the around the year 710 AD, the king on the coastal empire of present-day Pakistan was known as Raja Dair, and he took Muslim women and children who were sailing from the Persian Gulf across to Kerala, southern India, and that was an independent kingdom. So initially, the Caliph sent his famous general to punish and free the Muslim captives. Of course, Mohammed bin Qasim, he was a very famous general. He was only at the age of 18 and has become something of a legend. Yes. And he not just secured the hostages and their freedoms, but he also defeated Raja Dair and killed him. And then he headed towards the river Indus to what is now present-day Punjab. And so that was a significant achievement in the east.
And certainly for people in the subcontinent, his name lives on, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He's known as the Fateh, or the conqueror, also the opener of Islam into the Indian subcontinent. And I think in previous programs about the sitting, I alluded to that, actually, not to forget, Prophet had one Sahabi, he was an Indian, and he was the famous king of Kerala.
Yes.
And he's the first Indian convert to Islam.
Yes. So, on the western side, equally, Caliph Al-Walid the first was very lucky. He had another great general, Arif. Do you want to tell us about him?
Yes, probably one that people may be familiar with, but Tariq bin Zayed, and who basically, not a great deal known about his early life. There are lots of conflicting claims that he was Persian, that he was Arab, that he was from a Berber background, that he was originally a slave. But around the time of 710, 711 in the Common Era, he was the governor of Tangiers, and he was asked to basically lead an expedition from Morocco to Spain through Gibraltar. And he took a party of about 7,000, mainly new converts, and they crossed to now what is known as Gibraltar. And this is named actually after Tariq bin Zayed.
The Arabic term Jabal
Tariq, which means mountain of Tariq.
Yeah.
And that has obviously become shortened and changed slightly over the time. But basically, he landed at Gibraltar. And one of the things which he did, which is also very famous in terms of building loyalty, is that one of the first things he did was actually to burn the boats. And the reason for this was to actually create loyalty and spirit within his men. And if you permit me, I'll just read out what he actually said, or part of what he said. First of all, he stood up and he, in the name of God, thanked God that they had reached. But he said to his troops, "O my warriors, whither would you flee? Behind you is the sea, before you the enemy. You have left now only the hope of your courage and your constancy." So this invigorated his men. Obviously, then they were able then to start, in effect, the conquest or the spread of Islam into Spain and to the Iberian Peninsula. So this covered obviously Spain and Portugal, and the next some of the battles were up to Toledo, and he was a great general, you can say, who was part of that period where basically Islam spread in the Iberian Peninsula. There was some rivalry later on with another Muslim commander, Musa, until 714 they were both sent back and summoned back to Damascus. But his place in Muslim history, in the history of Gibraltar, in the history of Spain, is very well set. And as you said, lucky to be around, that he was around to actually lead this expedition.
And you mentioned, I think, earlier on, Arabic became the language of the empire. So these were some of the great achievements of Al-Walid. He was, of course, succeeded by his brother Suleiman from 715 to 717, a very short reign, but quite a bit of this reign was associated with the siege of Constantinople. They didn't have much luck, did they, Amjad?
No, they didn't, I'm afraid. It's, there's two Suleimans. There's Suleiman the Magnificent, who is a Turk.
That's a later period.
That's a later period, but there's also Suleiman, of course, from the Ummayyad. That was basically mainly a maritime expedition, but obviously they did not succeed at that time. And he lived, like I said, a very short reign. And in addition to his maritime expeditions that were conducted by his Amir al-Bahars, known as the admirals, and that's another Arabic word that has come into the English lexicon. Amir al-Bahar is now morphed into admiral. And during Suleiman's time, he also built some magnificent Ummayyad palaces and some hunting lodges.
Yes.
But it was actually his successor, known as Umar bin Abdulaziz. He was the 8th Umayyad Caliph.
Yeah, that was 717 to 720. Now, he's a very interesting personality, isn't he, in Muslim history? So tell us a little bit more about him.
Hazrat, he's held in high esteem despite coming from the ruthless Umayyad dynasty. We know what they were up to. Their histories were recorded and well known. And he was actually brought up in a palace as a prince, but he forsake the life of pomp and ceremony and lavish lifestyle, and he adopted the lifestyle of that of an ascetic and a Muslim Sufi. He was really admired by everyone, and he tried to initiate some reforms, particularly the equality. In contrast to his predecessors, he was known for his religious piety. He proclaimed the equality of all his subjects, Muslims, Arabs, and non-Muslims alike, and he established significant endowments in his time. And he also, it is said that he provided for the family of the Prophet, what remained of it, and wages and pensions, because they were really poorly dealt with by his predecessors, and he also and introduced a lot of administrative reforms, but unfortunately he only reigned for a good 3 years, and it is rumored, legend has it, that he was poisoned by his other greedy cousins and the sons of Al-Walid, the second, known as Yazid the third.
Yazid the second took over from him, so I
Yazid
assume it was not.
Yes, Yazid the second. Sorry,
Yeah.
Yazid the second took over from him, and it is rumored that Yazid the second's wife or one of his concubines poisoned the previous caliph, because he was a voice of reason, a voice of piety, a voice of dignity in a decadent Ummayyad, and they were unruly and unjust particularly towards the family and the household of the Prophet ﷺ, and to some of the tabi'een and the companions, the followers of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, were still in Medina and Mecca, and so he had to be done away with. But in a short-lived reign, he's held in high esteem, by even the Shias, the Sunnis, and everybody alike, and he's well admired. And some people say he's the sixth righteous caliph after the four Rashidun caliphs, and then the short-lived rule of Imam Hassan, who eventually abdicated in favor of Muawiyah, and then some even call him the fifth righteous caliph, although coming from the Umayyad dynasty.
Just one point as well, despite all of his many, many great qualities, historically some people say that this reorganization of the financial system actually led to a sort of a financial crisis. It meant that actually the revenues that were coming in were not as much. Whenever there's problems with money, this led to some sorts of feuds. And some of the tribes started fighting because of this lack of financial power, which obviously also leads to a reduction in military power as well. So despite all of his very good intentions, no doubt about it, there were obviously, this was a precursor of some of the problems that were later on to follow in the dynasty.
I mean, clearly the various caliphs that come after these, with probably the exception of Hisham, they were sort of trying to control a variety of rebellions. Amjad, do you want to sort of talk about
yes, of course,
some of those?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like my good friend Arif Saab has alluded to, the collection of distribution of tax revenues was always been a perennial problem for the Umayyads. The province governors were often reluctant to send some of the monies back to the central government and authority in Damascus, and some will often withhold and spend them on local population, both in a good way as in a bad way, because there were rebellions, like you mentioned towards the end, many rebellions, and they tried to obviously buy some of the opponents with money, and so forth, bribing people, and when they were not doing that, they were also trying to assassinate people, and obviously the resentment grew, particularly. And there's one figure who figures prominently on the rebellion is somebody called Al-Mukhtar, and he sided with the remaining party of Ali, known as the Shias, and he was known of Persian descent. And of course, Persians now converted to Islam, were predominantly Persia was part of the Muslim Empire, but Persians had their own deep-rooted cultural history, language, and they were the predominant empire themselves, and they didn't like particularly some of the discriminatory policies of the Umayyads. They were quite knowledgeable people, who had well-established culture of reading, writing, and learning, and were quite cultured Persians. So they really it did not go down well in the Persian provinces, and so Al-Mukhtar, he formed an alliance with the Abbasis. The Abbas is one of the uncles of the Prophet. He had 4 uncles: Abbas, Abu Talib, Hamza, to mention a few. So one of the descendants of the uncles of the Prophet, Abbas. Obviously, the Umayyads had no direct linkage other than through their great ancestor, Abdul Manaf, who was like great grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ. Whereas Abbasis, they were direct descendants from the Prophet's uncle, who was the son of his Prophet's grandfather, great grandfather, and. So basically, the Abbasis, the Shias, and the Persians allied against Caliph Marwan II, and who was himself really a decadent Caliph Marwan. He was not held in high esteem by the Arabs, by the Christian minorities either, and certainly the Persians and the Shias despised the Caliph. And in 750 AD, army of the Umayyad Caliph fought a combined forces of these 3 opponents, the major opponents of the Umayyads, the Abbasis, the Shias, and the Persians. And this battle is known as the Battle of the Zeb, one of the tributaries of the great river Tigris in modern-day Iraq. On paper, the army of the Caliph Marwan II looked far larger and formidable than that of his opponents, and it contained many of the veterans of early Umayyad campaigns against the Byzantium Empire, and of course, the support for the Umayyad Caliph was only lukewarm even in his own capital, Damascus. The morale of the Umayyads was damaged by series of defeats that were inflicted earlier by the rebels, and while the morale of the Abbasis army was really high, and it is said that the Abbasid army, the Abbasid, the Persian, the Shia combined forces, they formed a spear wall, a tactic that they had adopted from their Syrian opponents, presumably after witnessing this tactical move in the earlier battles. This kind of entail kind of a standing in a battle line with their lances pointing at the enemy, kind of what the English use, the English longbowmen used this tactic much later on in the history. So the Umayyad army thought that these combined forces of the Shias, the Persians, and Abbasis were inferior. They were just rebel rousers rather than a well-disciplined standing army. So they tried to charge at on the front. They mounted a fully charged cavalry charge at this battle line, which was held through the stake spears. And of course, that was a foolish move. They were all decimated. They charged at the line of spears. And they were decimated. And Caliph himself, Caliph Marwan, he basically escaped from the scene. All his army was routed. The one that was still standing, they just fled. He himself fled back to Damascus and subsequently to Palestine, and then down the coast of the Mediterranean into the Nile Delta, where he subsequently was caught and assassinated.
There is a sort of, well, it's not a story, it was a fact that the Abbasids then called all the Umayyads to a meeting, a reconciliation type meeting, and another unfortunate episode in Islamic history. But do you want to take us through that?
Well, of course, having vanquished their enemies, particularly the last Caliph Marwan II, and he fled and he was subsequently killed, as we all know. Yes, to reconcile. So it is a story, and there are obviously Umayyad historians that subsequently fled to Cordoba, and they write their history, and then there are versions of this history. But yes, it is one of the legend has it that Al-Safa, known as Al-Safa, the first founder of the Abbasi dynasty, and his brothers, they called a meeting to reconcile with the remaining princes of the Umayyads. And of course, the Umayyads were known for their lavish banquets and so on, and merrymaking and wining and dining in Damascus. So they were given the opportunity to reconcile, and they were invited to a banquet, and subsequently they were all arrested. Some of them were imprisoned, some of them were poisoned, some of them were killed. And of course, the Shias, they've been long victims of the wrath of Abbasis and their cruelties and injustices. And so were the Persians. So the combined forces, they basically looted the properties of the Umayyads, and they ransacked all the palaces and the treasuries and so on, because they've been not just that. There have been series of injustices, and we know of the greatest of injustices and calamity that befell was basically the demise and the martyrdom of Imam Hussain in Karbala, and nobody's supposedly forgotten that. It's still, it's a legacy. Imam Hussain was, we all know he was greatly loved and greatly admired by all the Muslims. He was a very noble individual and grandson of the Prophet, a clearly enlightened figure in Islamic history, a nobleman and religiously guided individual, a righteously guided individual, and that nobody forgot. So the Abbasis, being the heirs of the Prophet, because the remaining family of the Prophet, they went into seclusion and they withdrew from the worldly affairs, and they mainly concentrated in spiritual matters, and they refused to take part in political activity after the Battle of Karbala. So it was left to the Abbasi house, the other uncle of the Prophet, to take revenge, which was known among the common. It was a common feature among the Arabs. That when one tribe was wronged, the heirs of that tribe will rise again and take revenge. And of course, it was vendetta and hatred filled towards the Umayyads, and that accumulated in basically the graves being interned and so on, and the princes being poisoned and killed and hacked, and that went on for quite a number of years.
I think, Arif, just to say, this was, as I say, a very unsavory and unfortunate incident, but these things happen in dynasties. But I understand one prince survived from the Umayyads. Do you want to talk us through that a little bit?
Yes, I think Amjad mentioned him. I think it was the Marwan II. After he was defeated, it was Abdul Rahman
who survived as one of the princes who fled. Yeah.
He fled, and I think eventually he ended up becoming a Muslim ruler in Spain in the dynasty of in Cordoba. Mm-hmm. I think it was 756. So he was the last link to the Umayyads.
And that, of course, is a whole new chapter and a separate section of what the Umayyads, probably the greater achievement of the Umayyads in terms of intellectual input. But one thing is that there was clearly a lot of intrigue during the Umayyad period, and that's what happens when dynasties start being set up, because religion has its own mission for people, transforming their hearts and minds and changing them. But dynasties, whichever, whether you look at the Chinese or the Indians or the Europeans or whatever, they have this unsavory part of their history.
I think there's another lesson that you can learn from history as well here, Dr. Iqbal, is that empires eventually do come crashing down. So while they were good at maybe building up empires, and the move from a religious caliphate to a dynastic caliphate, eventually it was doomed. It was bound to fail because of these divisions, because of these jealousies, because of these problems with monies. And that's what tends to happen with all dynasties, and their dynasty was no different.
In many respects, the Holy Prophet ﷺ had actually prophesied how the Muslim Ummah is going to go through these different phases of decline, kingships, etc. as well. So from a religious point of view, it is known, but for us, it's important to know our history and know some of the painful moments as well as some of the great moments.
Absolutely. One of the saying of the Prophet is that my ummah is like the hump of the camel. The hump of the camel, we know now from modern analysis, this is a Gaussian curve. It has plateaus, but there is obviously as an up and a down. And this is what one of the prophecies of the Prophet ﷺ is, that my community is going to be like the hump of a camel. It will have a small beginning, humble beginning, ultimately will rise, and just like the hump of the camel does, it will climax, and it will go to the four corners of the world. But of course, my good friend Arif has mentioned, is a good student of history. All empires that rise, they eventually fall. But what it is that what is the lesson from this history is that the family of the Prophet, how dignified they were, what remains of them, they went into seclusion, and they claim that they still have, of course, in the community of the Shias. And as you know, although my name suggests otherwise, I'm not a Shia, as you know, but I have a great love for the family of the Prophet. They were really noble in defeat as well, and noble in calamities. And of course, there are legends about Abdul Rahman the First.
We will tackle that in another session. I think we've had a fascinating discussion about the first Ummayyad phase, and inshallah we will talk, as I said, separately about the Spanish phase as well. So I want to thank you, Amjad Hussain Sab and Arif Ahmad Sab, and inshallah we will join Voice of Islam Living History listeners next time. Thank you and goodbye.